morning, everyone, and welcome to our first symposium on AI in the FAS. As you know, this has been an incredibly hot topic, both in higher ed and throughout society. It has the potential to change the way we work, the way we learn, the way we live. And this new technology has generated more than just questionable essays and funny images and wacky art. It's really given us a tool that, when wielded well, can open new opportunities for research and new pathways for knowledge. Here in the FAS, we've seen some challenges that AI can create. However, we've also seen some amazing opportunities that come with it. So this year, we've been investing in the positives, looking for all the ways that we can channel this powerful technology to create a better world. From the sciences to the arts, there are so many fascinating ways that AI can help us discover more about our world and more about ourselves. Here at the FAS, we're in a unique position to explore questions and challenges that come from this new technology. Our community, of course, is full of brilliant thinkers, curious researchers, knowledgeable scholars, all able to lend their variety of expertise to tackling the big questions in AI, from ethics to societal implications. And today, we're looking forward to showcasing several members of our FAS community and many of their AI-related projects and activities, focusing particularly on areas of academic and research integrity, pedagogy, and administrative innovation. So I'm really excited to share all of this incredible work with you, especially because it highlights so many extraordinary ways that AI technology can benefit all the disciplines across the FAS. This year has absolutely been one of exploration and discovery, and we've learned so many interesting things as a result. None of this would be possible without the incredible efforts of so many FAS faculty and staff who shared their time, their expertise, their energy, and their imaginations with us, helping shape the future of AI in the FAS. In particular, I'd like to thank the hardworking members of the Artificial Intelligence Systems Working Group, who have worked really hard with members in our community in thinking about the risks and opportunities that AI brings, and how we can use this technology to advance our academic mission and our organizational effectiveness. I'm especially grateful to our co-chairs, Professor Latanya Sweeney and Scott Jordan, for their leadership and their commitment to this effort. They've done tremendous work with this project, helping us get to this place of transition, where our working group will become a full-fledged FAS initiative. And you'll be hearing from both of them in just a minute. I'd also like to express my gratitude to Dean Stubbs, who announced today he's been deposed, as we have just yesterday announced a new divisional dean of science. Nonetheless, and I know there's big shoes to be filled, Chris has been an incredible advisor to me in artificial intelligence, and though he will be stepping down as Divisional Dean of Science, he's still on the hook because he's agreed to be my special advisor on artificial intelligence moving forward. And I'm so grateful for the work he's done and will do on behalf of the FAS, thinking about the ways we can benefit from this technology. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you for being here today. This is an incredible turnout for a relatively early morning on a rainy spring day, especially as we move to the end of term. To me, this indicates there's a real interest in this topic in our community, and I'm excited to hear from more of you today about the benefits and struggles you've encountered with AI in the workplace. So now, without further ado, I'm going to turn over the podium to Scott and Latanya, the dynamic duo, who will share more about what they've done and what's to come. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Awesome. You good?
Yeah, I'm good.
All right.
We've had a wonderful time together, that's for sure.
We have indeed. I'm first, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
you go first.
Good morning. It's good to be here. And it's so good to see everybody together on a cloudy day. It's still cloudy out there, right? It's just, what a wonderful day. I'm so excited for this in so many dimensions. First, this exciting new technology that isn't really that new anymore, but it's still pretty new. But it feels like our engagement with it is evolving every day. Bringing faculty, staff, and students together to talk about this together. That doesn't happen every day here, and I'm just thrilled to see some of my colleagues from the administrative side just as excited as faculty and students are to be here and to talk about this work. I do want to thank, part of my job here is to offer thanks to lots of people. I first want to thank Claudine Gay for setting up this committee, for seeing this technology for what it was and saying this is something really important we need to focus on this year. And Dean Hopi Hoekstra for continuing and for her enthusiasm and excitement, and for appointing Latanya and me together to do this work. And from my perspective, as I was appointed, I thought, sure, as an administrator, good to have an administrator to the table, but also I think maybe as an everyman. I knew nothing about AI really before appointed. And of course, who here did, a year ago, know much about it? Engaging with it for the first time at Chris Stubbs' urging and seeing the ChatGPT, box that is as simple as the Google box where you type something in, and playing with it for a moment on my living room couch with my family around saying, hey, there's this new thing Chris Stubbs told me about, let's see. And I asked it just for fun, write a poem about our beloved family dog who had passed away a few months earlier. And the poem it wrote moved the whole family to tears. And I thought, oh, wow, this is serious. Like this isn't like a toy. This didn't write a limerick. This is serious. And from there we go, right, to helping us answer emails, helping us with scientific work, helping, of course, write papers and dissertations. But wow, what a powerful technology and how far we've come in our understanding. I want to thank members of the AI working group, especially the leaders of our subgroups, Will Petrick and Melissa Dell. Thank you for leading the Academic and Research Integrity group, Chris Stubbs and Amanda Claybaugh for the Pedagogy group, Ismail Carreras and Rakesh Khurana for leading the Administrative Innovations group. Also, I want to thank folks at the center, the university-wide steering committee led by then Provost, now President Alan Garber and Meredith Weinick. Also to Hewitt, oh my. From the moment we heard of this to the moment we had the sandbox with all the LLMs ready with like level 3 security built, it felt like days. But I know it took a huge effort and a lot of people's time and energy. And I want to thank Klara Yelenkova and her team for standing that up. And then for today's event, thank you, Valerie Bylinson, Tiffany Ashton-Court, Jess Brown, Liz Rader, and Catherine Gates for your support for the working group and for organizing this great event today. And the last person I want to thank is Latanya Sweeney. Getting to know you during this last year has been one of the real joys for me here, at Harvard so far. Your expertise and your wisdom and your humor and it's just like wonderful to work with you. And now I want to turn it over to you for your introduction.
Don't go away too far.
Okay,
There's
more
thank yous. Oh yeah, there's more thank yous to say. It has been a real pleasure working also with Valerie and Catherine. We met weekly, and part of what made it a pleasure though was it was kind of a fun mission. How do you bring an entire college along with you into a challenge of exploring AI? We live right now in what many historians call the third industrial revolution. And they often put the start date in 1950 with semiconductors, and then comes computers, mainframe computers and personal computers, the Internet of Things, where AI is a revolution within a revolution. And it's just changed all aspects of our life. But it reminds us that we live in a unique time a really special time where all of our society is being reorganized around technological change. In that way, even like the Second Industrial Revolution, but even more so. And we don't know when it's going to end, but right now we're in the middle of the AI revolution. We're also really fortunate to be at Harvard in this moment because it's such a unique opportunity where the impact of the technology is on what does it mean to be a discipline or scholarly disciplines, or the kind of content that we want to leave behind, the new opportunities that it poses, the teaching learning environment shifts that are possible are much more sweeping than the other versions of changes that technology brought from work. If you think about this revolution, when I was a college student, it was pen and paper and a calculator. And now we've got word processing, spell correcting, grammar checking, and each one of them has been a bit of a revolution. But when you add something like a large language model or a ChatGPT, it's totally something quite different. We're fortunate to be at Harvard in this moment where we can help shape what that means. So in my own work, I do work on unforeseen consequences of technology and how to harmonize technology and society. This is a pivotal moment for all of us in society. And I think being here, we really have the opportunity to lead. So one of the things that's really easy, of course, is to just say, I'm just accepting this technology blindly, or I'm rejecting it blindly. That's the easy one that doesn't actually lead us to a win-win solution. We have to sweat the details. We've got to figure out what it is and how it's going to impact us so that we can shape how that future happens. And that's the challenge of all of us. That was our challenge in the first year, was just to bring the community along, to expose everyone to AI and help them become a part of that shaping. And maybe you'll tell us about some of the things we did.
Oh, sure. We did so much this year as a community, and to engage in the way that we have and the way you all have. And to, thank you so much. Started off holding staff meetings, et cetera, and announcing, hey, there's a sandbox. Anyone try it yet? One or two hands. By the end of the year, in almost any large gathering, I would say, who's been using ChatGPT or the sandbox in your work? Almost everyone raises their hand now, and I'm sure that you're all here today. If I were to ask that question, you all would. So, fabulous success, this engagement this year. And I'm just going to highlight a few of the things that we have done. First, of course, working, and most of this credit goes to the center on this, but the HILT conference in September, exposing folks to how AI could be designed, implemented, and governed, especially in the space of pedagogy and teaching and learning. In December, we hosted a mini conference doing very much the same thing in the FAS. The Bach Center, anyone from Bach here today? Shout out to the Bach Center for jumping right in and seeing how the pedagogy, how important AI is to pedagogy and to their role in spreading the word around FAS. They've conducted more than 20 departmental workshops for faculty and workshops for graduate students in incorporating AI in their teaching. Our staff, our fabulous FAS staff, have embraced this and are using it every day. And you'll see today in one of our panels some of the examples of that. The Office of the Vice Provost for Research is also tracking a number of programs to do more with AI, especially using AI as a research tool, but also as a subject of research, and wanting Harvard to lead in that space. We've also got a number of fellowships, undergraduate fellowships now that are focused on AI. All of this stood up in about 9 months' time. So I do want to just offer huge enthusiasm and appreciation for the whole of the Harvard and FAS community for embracing this and putting really Harvard at the leading edge of this work at the institutional level. I'd offer to give us all a round of applause for our leadership, but I know we're short on time today and we want to get right to it.
Yeah, and also I just want to give us a preview of what it is that's coming today. So one of the things it's an opportunity to both reflect and put more bones on the details of the kinds of activities people have done over the year. But the main goal is for you to actually use it as a launching pad to reflect further and lean more into the future. So we're going to start off with a panel on original scholarship in AI. Then we'll have a panel on faculty research in AI from across FAS, a panel on teaching innovation with AI, and a panel on student perspectives. And that's just in the morning. Then we have a getting started workshop for those of you who, if we were to raise hands right now, who's tried it, still don't quite raise your hands. Or if you've tried it, but some of the things that you're hearing and seeing makes you want to push a little further, the Getting Started workshop will be a great opportunity. And the library will also present new ways to explore knowledge using AI and other tools. At lunchtime, I teach a class, Gov 1430, and our students will do a poster fair. The students call it the Save the World class. This is where they anticipate problems with technology, do an experiment to show or offer solutions. They will have their posters. There's about 60 of them expected for lunchtime. Feel free to walk around, and I'm sure they would engage, love to have the conversation. Then after lunch, we have an administrative show and tell, where we see some really amazing innovations that the staff itself has underway. And we end with a student engagement show and tell from Gen Ed 1188. So that's the day ahead. Feel free to pick and choose your activities. We have put together a really good suite, and we could have done this a second day. It's pretty amazing how much work there is on this campus. Now, with that, we've heard his name mentioned a zillion times. And that would be Chris Stubbs. I'm going to ask Chris Stubbs to come up and talk about, from here to next year, now that you've got the ear of the dean.
Thank you. Thank you, Scott and Latanya. So I'll just share a few thoughts, phrased really as questions. So if the dean is looking for specific advice, the best I can do right now is provide a list of questions. Is this technology an existential threat to our entire business model, or a remarkable opportunity for us to pivot and take a leadership role? My answer to that is yes. Okay? It's changing really fast. If you're tempted to dismiss this technology on the basis of its current limitations, I think that would be a mistake. It's improving really rapidly, and we need to pay attention to that. I think from the standpoint of the undergraduate program, I see three primary questions that are before us. One is, how do we use these tools to improve student learning? How do we use them in our teaching to increase the effectiveness? And I think there's some really good early evidence that if used appropriately, they can be really powerful helpers for student learning. Question number two, our students are going to leave Harvard with these tools being embedded in what they do. So how do we teach our students to be ethical, competent, knowledgeable, skeptical users of this toolkit? What skills are we going to give them? And in particular, how are we going to help them assess truth when they're flooded with information, misinformation, hallucinations? That was bad enough already. This is only going to make it worse. So I think we have that obligation. Question number three, if this technology can do every homework problem I have ever assigned in an introductory physics course, how can we incentivize our students to invest the level of effort that's necessary to get deep domain knowledge? Because I think it's the product of domain knowledge and this toolkit that's going to propel productivity in the future. That's a hard problem. And more broadly, where do we want Harvard to be as higher education pivots to accommodate this disruptive technology that just came at us like COVID, unanticipated, out of left field? Is Harvard going to be leading the conversation in higher education? Are we going to be the innovators? Or are we going to sit back and let Cornell fall on its face and then figure out what they did wrong and be second in line? I think that's an open question. So I do think it's a challenge to us to pivot as an institution. I think we have a lot of great examples coming up today that'll give you vignettes. I'll be the first person to tell you that these tools are flawed. They're better at some things than they are at other things. And I think part of our goal is to map out that frontier and to understand where the right place is to move forward. I do want to just make two other points. I want to really reiterate my thanks to Hewitt. I think our colleagues in Hewitt pivoted remarkably rapidly. I'm unaware of any academic institution that moves so fast to implement a privacy-protected toolkit and put it at the disposal of the community. Last point, and then I'll get off the stage. I started programming computers by throwing individual switches and sending binary code loaded into pedestrian computers. And now I can tell the computer in natural language what program I want it to write for me. That happened in my lifetime. This is the most exciting change in technology I have ever experienced. And the fact that we now move to putting high-powered computation at the disposal of people where you don't necessarily have to learn how to program is, I think, an underappreciated element of this transformation. The natural language interaction with information, I think, is going to be a big deal. And if that's lowered the barrier of computation for all of us, then the interesting questions are things like the following. When I give a talk in front of a room full of faculty and I say, how many of you think it's perfectly fine to use ChatGPT to write a letter of recommendation? Half the hands go up. If I say, how many of you think it's an egregious breach of trust, violation, and abhorrent to all of your values? The other half of the hands go up, okay? We have no established norms within our society. We have no clarity of expectations. We don't understand what ethical guardrails to impose. We don't understand what regulatory role the government has. And all of those questions are in the domain of the humanities and the social sciences. I think this is an opportunity for a huge resurgence in what we do in that domain, helping our society cope with this just disruptive transient that came and jolted us from the side. And I think Harvard can play a leading role in cultivating that conversation nationally. I'm going to say one other thing. I'm going to thank Logan McCarty, my co-instructor for Janet 1188, who at some point long ago I force-fed him Kool-Aid and he's now drunk it. So thank you all for coming today. It's going to be great. It's a wonderful opportunity for us as an institution. I'm anxious to talk to anyone who has thoughts about this, and back over to Latanya.
And with that, we're off for our first panel. Let's go ahead and have the panelists come up. So we're excited about this panel. This is, clearly there's important research happening throughout the campus that's underway on AI and how to construct and be a part of the construction of the new generation of AI itself. But that's not the goal of this panel. The goal of this panel, though many of them could speak to it, the goal of this panel is to focus on the use, wrong session, sorry. So Amanda Claybaugh couldn't be here today. I'm actually standing in for her. That was my own talk for my own panel. Valerie's like, no, stop. So let me start that over again. Before we dive in, I want to thank our co-sponsors, the Mahindra Humanities Center and the Edmund and Lily Safra Center for Ethics. So the conversation we're actually going to have right now is a part of the Can We Talk conversation series that has been running. And we're really grateful for Bruno Carvalho for allowing us to use that framework to guide our discussion today. What we want to start off with is actually a really timely conversation around the concept of authorship in the space of AI. And it's clearly undergoing a profound transformation. What does it mean for your work to be your own? There is no single answer to this question, and across academia, the responses do differ based on norms and values of different disciplines, and is constantly evolving. So we brought together panelists to help us explore the shifting boundaries and ethical considerations of authorship in the age of AI and how those vary across fields. Let me just sort of introduce everyone, and then they'll take it from there. So we have Melissa Dell, who's the Andrew Furr Professor of Economics, David Joselit, who's the Arthur Kingsley Porter Professor of Art, Film, and Visual Studies, Alex Csiszar, who's the Professor of the History of Science, Mike Smith, who's the John Finley Professor of Engineering and Applied Sciences, C's and Harvard University Distinguished Service Professor. So it's a wonderful way to jump us off into a conversation on authorship. We'll let each of the panelists give us a few words, and then we'll start a discussion, and we'll take questions at the end. Oh, we're so organized here. So yes, you may go first. How about we just go this way?
All right, I did not know I was going first, but this is great. So I come at this question from a sort of funny position because I'm maybe representing the sort of qualitative social sciences, but I'm a historian of scientific authorship. So I think I'm going to lean more towards the sort of history of the question of authorship, which is something I can say something about. So this, I guess the first question you were prompted with was like, how is AI going, or LLMs going to sort of revolutionize authorship? And I immediately, being the historian, said, that's probably not exactly the right question, because or at least it's a little bit misleading, because it sort of suggests that there was some stable and non-problematic conception of authorship that we started with, say, 10, 15 years ago before people were interested in this. But it's not exactly right. Like, it seems to me that scientific authorship had all these sort of problems that have been mounting up for quite a long time, independently of this question of AI. But it seems to me that the moment of LLMs kind of take some of those problems and exacerbate them, or really sort of get us to a tipping point where all of a sudden we really have to think differently. So in particular, one of the big problems with scientific authorship for a long time now has been how to think about multiple authorship, certainly in biology, but especially in sort of high energy physics, where you have papers with humongous numbers of authors. And that really sort of brings to the fore a bunch of questions about what do we mean by authorship, right? So authorship can mean a lot of different things. Most folks say it has something to do with some combination of credit and responsibility, which is fine. But responsibility itself is a complicated business. And I was thinking about this, especially in the context of AI, and I realized, philosophers of science have some interesting things to say about this these days. And there's this interesting philosopher named Hisson Dang, who's come up with a nice tripartite framework for this. So authorship can be, on the one hand, a matter of sort of attributability, like sort of a causative notion of authorship. It can be a claim about somebody being able to say why something is true, so explainability. And then there's maybe sort of a kind of a sense of responsibility that has to do with blameworthiness or creditworthiness or something like that. And what we've already figured out is that there's lots of cases in the sciences in which no one person will necessarily hold all those three senses of responsibility. And so one of the ways that people have tried to sort of deal with this is to sort of move from authorship to contributorship, right? And that seems like a good way to go. So move away from this sort of unified notion of an author, that's a kind of 19th century concept, and just sort of, think of like a film credit roll at the end kind of thing. And, in that framework, all of a sudden, AI would fit much more nicely, I think, in how we operate. But it doesn't quite solve a whole bunch of other questions about the role that authorship plays in the scientific and academic enterprise. And so that's my sort of first thought about how things are going to change. It's not necessarily going to revolutionize anything, but it's going to sort of force us to take seriously a whole bunch of problems that already existed. Authorship. So I wrote a book about authorship in the 19th century, basically saying it was a mishmash of a concept then, it's a mishmash of a concept now, and it's just more mishmashy. And so at this point, I think its time might be done, but what comes next is complicated. I have more to say, but I won't go on too long.
Thanks so much. That's a hard act to follow. I'm in the economics department. I do work mostly on using deep learning, using AI to bring in new data to answer questions in the social sciences. So one thing that I've worked a lot on is semantic similarity, and can we use language to say, did these two pieces of writing come from the same source? Can we use language to think about what's a novel concept in academic research? So we've taken a corpus of over 1 billion historical newspaper articles, used that to train a language model that can say, did these two texts come from the same underlying source? Because about half of the content is coming from news wires, and we know what did, and we can do that very accurately. Taken that, applied it to the the snapshot of the internet that essentially that most large language models have been trained on, and showing that they did not do a very adequate job of removing duplicated content, noisily duplicated content, and that matters for the performance of the language models. It makes them more likely to reproduce text verbatim, which of course raises a lot of challenges if you're using a language model to write something and you've inadvertently plagiarized someone. And then we've been working with data from JSTOR, data from Elsevier, to say, can we see how similar language is across different domains? So I'm an economist. We use lots of quantitative methods. If you're describing the assumptions of a statistical procedure, you might not be able to change that language too much before the definition becomes wrong, right? And so there's some domains where we would expect if people are speaking about that domain, they're not going to use very original language because they can't. They're talking about a precise concept. But on the other end, we've been working to again train a large language model that can tell us in a way that kind of many reasonable people would agree with, okay, this is a novel concept and we can figure that out from the language. And so essentially what a language model does is it takes your text, which is a series of words, and it maps that into this continuous vector space. So you turn your text into vectors, and then you can do computations with those, right? So like ChatGPT is predicting what word comes next. And so I'm always thinking about similarity of language, originality of language in terms of this vector space and how dissimilar sort of are these vectors. And I think like the technology exists today that suppose you wanted to have a plagiarism checker in Google Docs or in Microsoft Word, you could do that, right? You could just measure the similarity of the text that you wrote to whatever corpus that they happen to have. And then it could use the large language model to rewrite that so it's below that threshold similarity, and there's not a problem. But does that make the work any more your own? Not really. It's been rephrased, and I think it's always the case that, outright plagiarism is clear, that's not okay, but when we get into this mushy space of has this been sufficiently sufficiently paraphrased, we kind of get into this mushy space, and I think AI changes that because it can ensure that everything is, sufficiently paraphrased, but does that make the work more your own? I think that's that's sort of the question that probably depends on discipline, right? If you're in economics like me, a big part of what makes your work original and your own has nothing to do with the language, right? It's the regression analysis that you run. And how you describe that, nobody's going to read it anyway. They go straight to the tables, right? And so people, we had a hard time finding a quantitative social scientist for this panel because we said, have you thought about this? I think largely not, in part for that reason. And so, if somebody is using ChatGPT to paraphrase a description of their statistical method, as long as they ensure that it's correct, people aren't going to care. In the humanities, that might be very, very different, which is a big part of why we wanted to bring people from different disciplines together today.
That's great.
Thanks. Good morning. I'm David Joselit, and I'm trained as an art historian. So for me, the challenge of AI has precedent in recent changes or modern changes in art, where the idea of authorship has been almost completely undermined as something that one does by hand since at least the late 1960s or 70s. What was important is more the concept and the kind of authorization of the work. In other words, accepting it as the outcome that you wished for. So to some extent, it seems to me that AI is a mechanization of that kind of distribution of authorship. And what I mean by that is that I think it's really important to understand it as a genre, not exclusively as a tool. I mean, I assigned in a graduate seminar that was equal parts literary and art historical students to do a series of prompts at the end of the course. And it was a hilarious 2 sessions where we really talked about how the prompt generated a certain set of outcomes and how successive prompts lead to different kinds of outcomes to try to understand, you could say, the prompt as a literary genre and not even think about the output as what was important. This is how the history of art in some ways, and literature too, which I know less professionally, allows us to think through AI not as a kind of terrible threat or utopian tool, but rather a genre like many others. Throughout the history of creative thought, there have been enormous consequential technological revolutions, photography, film, radio, et cetera, right up to the internet. And there's always been a humanist response to this because we understand how to read form. So the prompt is one form, and the other is the data set, which I think is very important. Often for lay people, which include myself, the data set is in the black box, right? We don't see it. But the fact is, those data sets are collections, like a museum collection, that are formed by human beings and that, as many of you I'm sure know, have intense biases and also particular, they generate or condition certain kinds of outcomes. They're also curated by humans. They're annotated, they're scraped, they're specific. So I think that one of the points of intervention that's particularly important is for us to understand how to work not only with the tool, but also to intervene in the kinds of data sets that are being, or at least understand them, that the tools are being trained on.
Terrific, thank you. So I'm Mike Smith. I'm over in the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences. So I'm going to take the very tool-based approach to the world here. I also want to comment a little bit on what Alex was saying. There's a lot of mushiness in this, in my opinion. We talk about authorship, right? And it's hard to understand what we mean by authorship, and there's certain ways that we view it. We talk about original scholarship in this title here, which to me is not exactly the same thing. We think about it differently as we do our work, as opposed to the writing that we produced at the end, or the artifact in my world if we're producing something, to the question of creativity, which is in many of the questions that are in the blurb here, which again is a different view on this, all being very nebulous, all having overlaps, all not being very precise. So this will be fun, is the way I look at it. Just to say a few words, like scholarship in my world, I'll talk for STEM people, and I expect 95% of you to disagree with what I'm about to say. I think there's less concern. Again, if you think about this as a tool and you think about what is it that I want to use this tool to accomplish in the work that I do, and the work that we do is to come up with a new theory or come up with an artifact. And it's not sufficient just to come up with that artifact. You've got to actually come up with, how did it work? Why did it work? Right? Did you test it? How did you go about testing it? Your theories are no good if you can't actually have them be testable. And right now the tool doesn't do that for us. It can help us do those things, but it doesn't, in my opinion, do those sorts of things for us. And then I worry about questions of, as Melissa was saying, in terms of, am I using this tool to decide whether it's a yes-no categorical question in this world? And threshold. So I tried this, and I teach a critical thinking and data science class, trying to get a number of our data science graduate students to be thinking about the tools that they're building before they actually just release them on the world, and what kinds of questions should they ask. And so we put forth to the class, what makes a piece of, say, data set synthetic, right? Where it's not just capturing the real world, and forget the details of how difficult it is to capture the real world appropriately anyway, but what makes a data set synthetic. We had a huge discussion in the class, from just one, if you will, line in a table being changed makes it synthetic, to people believe that's not enough. And the moment you try to come down to, well, what is the number in it? You just can't do it, right? So much depends on the context of what you're talking about, that you can't come up with this single number as you go forward. So it complicates many of our discussions as individuals are talking from different points of view, where we have our own internal field-specific thoughts in this space that don't necessarily cross these boundaries. So I'll leave those to start with, and we go from there.
Well, that was pretty much a very wide spectrum, which was pretty amazing, from the history of authorship to it's a vector of words and properties, and how do I convert it into that space and figure out its similarity to a genre, which is really interesting, to these questions around the nature of, in some ways, the nature of creativity. I don't know if you guys want to respond to each other before we open it up to the panel, because that was a pretty rich space.
I mean, I could, what Melissa sort of described as the sort of problem of deciding what's sort of genuinely new and what's plagiarism is kind of such a central question, right? And as you say, it really varies from field to field in ways. I haven't talked about the historians at all yet in terms of how we will operate. I still won't for a little while. But so one thing that I was sort of thinking about in exactly this sort of problem of, thinking about vector spaces and things like that, and is that this is like a fundamentally difficult problem to solve with authorship. And it seems to me that authorship might be the wrong concept for what's sort of happening now. And as I was thinking about this, I'm actually reminded of it's more like the 17th century rather than the 19th or 20th century. So there's this, it seems to me we've kind of, we're entering a space that moves away from the ability to attribute through citations and things like that, particular claims to particular people. So if you think of LLMs as a model that's essentially a really useful compression of a whole bunch of stuff in order to make a bunch of stuff useful, it's really more like the kind of sort of commonplace books, florilegiums that were big in the 17th century, where people gathered together quotations and stuff from all over the place and created these big books that had a bunch of stuff. They didn't care about who authored the quotes. It was just all the important stuff. And then you use that to make new stuff, right? And that sort of model really fell apart in the 19th century with the emergence of scientific authorship as we know it today, and the notion that you had, rather than sort of, making these sort of abridgments of a bunch of stuff, you sort of wrote a bunch of short papers, and you kept everything, and you linked it all together through citations. And the citation really mattered, and all that. And the author was sort of the linchpin of that system. The 20th century kind of moves towards a kind of model of information and compression, which still kind of operates on papers at first, so that vector space concept comes from people like Gerald Salton at Cornell, who was really interested in figuring out some measures of relevance between papers and things like that. We're in a moment now where we move away from the paper towards just the archive itself, which sort of makes that whole sort of infrastructure of papers and authors seem irrelevant, right? And it's not something you're going to be able to sort of put together, it seems to me. So we might want to think about being in a kind of new we have a new epistemology of condensation that we're in that really is not compatible with authorship as we know it.
I don't know if anybody wants to respond to that.
Well, I want to ask Alex a question, unless you want to go.
I did want to respond to that just a little bit.
Go for it.
Because I think that something I've been thinking about a lot has to do maybe with what you're talking about, this kind of equalization of citation, or somehow, one citation can be exchanged for another, because it suggests a kind of collapse of a deep historical time as well. Like any particular fact from now is equal to any particular fact from some other era, and we have access, if they're available, we have access to them on an equal basis. And so, since you're a historian, I wonder, I feel like there is a kind of shift among students too, in terms of really thinking historically. They're thinking about aggregating positions as opposed to kind of creating genealogies, it seems to me.
That could be. I mean, that seems consistent with what I'm sort of thinking about. I don't know, but that's an interesting idea. Yeah.
So I want to split apart authorship for a moment from citation. You talked about both, but I want to talk specifically. And as a historian, why do we cite? Can you give us can we ask ChatGPT right now? Why is it we cite?
Yeah, so that is, so I'm actually writing a book about the history of how people answer that question, but it's complicated, right? We cite for a whole bunch of reasons, right? Whole bunch of reasons. When I brought up citation just now, I think I was mostly thinking about citing for the purpose, well, two purposes: to give credit and to sort of give people a sort of give readers or audiences a kind of historical survey of a field. So one of the reasons citations emerged in the 19th century was exactly to make papers shorter and put the history into the footnote, you might say. So you learn the history of something by following the footnotes rather than having a treatise that has history and the new stuff, right? So that's one thing, but it's also about attribution and things like that. But so, and there's a whole bunch of other stuff going on as well, but those are two things, yeah.
So those are the two I would have given you as a non-historian, not being able to say, but that's how I've learned to cite, both for give credit where credit was due, where you brought it forth, and also to understand how we've built upon others as we've moved forward. It's being, I think, weaponized today, right, to be used to figure out how much of this paper can we claim is actually this person's or not, but that wasn't our original purpose. And if we bring it back to the AI, how do you see this fitting into the fact that we're being pushed today to cite AI systems? Because I don't think about giving credit to an AI system in the same way I think about giving credit to a person. And it's clear that it doesn't help me with the historical record of the foundation on which we built. So how do you...
I mean, that's why I think it's problematic, right? So it's exactly that problem. So that the notion of authorship and citation, and sort of they go together, presupposes some notion that you can follow it. So this is where the history, my being a historian, does matter in terms of my field. We really, in some ways, some people have argued that footnotes are the closest thing that historians have to experiments, kind of thing, right? And there's a notion that for the historian that you follow the footnotes wherever they lead, and then you can figure out the why of something. That second sense of authorship that I mentioned, the second sense of responsibility, the sort of explainability, right? It seems as if, and this is why I think there's this shift back to the 17th century, that it is very difficult with LLMs to follow those tracks, right? There's a kind of serious break that happens right there. So that citation in that sense ceases to make sense. At least citation can mean lots of things. It's got to mean at least those two things usually, I think. And insofar as it doesn't, that particular concept has to change in a fundamental way, or it doesn't quite. It's ironic because it's through studying these citation links that a lot of the basic technology was developed way back when, and now it's destroying the kind of basis of it's kind of eating itself.
Yeah, to me, there's an interesting tension that comes up now, right? Because we don't want the LLM systems to provide verbatim things back. And at the same time, because we want the synthesis that takes place, we want the randomness that takes place in these as we move forward. At the same time, too much of, so anyway.
Yeah, no, it's exactly, there's that article in the New Yorker, the sort of LLM as a sort of lossy JPEG idea, which is like, the lossiness is actually highly useful. But is it really useful that something be lossy in this? Anyway, it's an interesting tension here.
And I mean, it depends what LLM you're using. So like if you're using ChatGPT, it's just predicting what word comes next. There's no sense of cited sources because it doesn't have any. That information is just compressed in its parameters. But there's an entire kind of massive and rapidly growing field of retrieval augmented language models. So you still have the generative language model, but it's retrieving a bunch of stuff explicitly from some database, from the internet, some sort of external database, and then essentially summarizing that. And it might make up stuff still, it still has that, predict the next word, but then at least it can cite what information it retrieved to pull in its prompt. And I think that that's very useful for a range of academic applications, because at least then you know where it came up with this and can go track that down yourself if needed, and perhaps properly cite that piece of information if it's useful.
As I understand it pedagogically, when I was teaching with colleagues at Gen Ed class, we allowed AI, but the citation was precisely to mark lack of authorship, to say, right. I have used AI to this extent, in order, if one discovers it later, that they've in fact cited, that they've done that, as opposed to telling them they can't do it at all. And to kind of gauge what then their, where their contribution begins and that contribution ends. But of course it's not, it's not precise, but.
So I have problems with the word contribution there, but for a second, thinking of it as a tool for a moment, what tools do you require the author to disclose and which ones do you not?
Well,
Is this a
it's
temporal
messy.
thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like if you used Wikipedia, you would say, you would give a source. So, yeah, it's unclear. I don't think norms have been established yet, but we kind of tried to address this through this sort of vague paragraph, which, marked the issue.
So beyond the acknowledgement, there's this kind of flip side of the conversation happening around misconduct. So how would you flip it around and answer the question? I mean, our students are afraid often to even think about using ChatGPT or any large language model for fear that it'll be considered misconduct. So you guys, what do you think about?
I think it complicates, how we think about misconduct for sure. So let's take for a moment the case of plagiarism. That requires intent. And I think in the definition that we use here at Harvard, there is this kind of caveat for gross negligence. But the lawyers don't like that because that's very difficult to prove, right? And so, we had a lot of conversations with the committee this semester, different people on campus, and they were telling us in misconduct, well, we've seen this now come up as a defense. I used AI, I didn't know, I didn't have intent, and therefore, am I responsible for this? And it becomes there's a question from a scholarly standpoint of how problematic that is, and then also just from a legal standpoint, we have a legal definition of what misconduct is. And I think that could, that could, certainly it comes up with faculty misconduct, but it could extend to students as well, right? It's very difficult to prove that they used it. If they said they used it, does it actually then make it harder to hold them accountable for other types of misconduct?
Yeah, this is a mess right now, right, where we are today. Certainly in the classes, I allow students to use the tools in my class. We can talk about exactly how if you're interested. There's a great amount of fear. This is why I also get back to this citing. I think citing is a really poor example of what we're trying to do by taking an old world and moving it into a new world and not getting much benefit out of it, right? I've read some of these where people want to know exactly how did you use it. It's much more informative if a person tells you, this is how I employed the AI tool in doing the work that I did. It's not only more descriptive of what took place, and you can come up with a better evaluation of whether this was appropriate or not, but it also helps the rest of us learn, because we're all in the process right now of trying to understand how best to use these tools to accomplish what it is we want to accomplish. And I also think it's important to be thoughtful from the beginning. Right? Don't fall into this and without thinking clearly about how you want to be using the tools. I use with my students a simple little organization that says, look, are you trying to delegate work? And sometimes there's a perfectly good reason for you to delegate work, right? I need this task done. In my world, I need to write some code. There's a library over here. I don't know how to use the library. I'll ask ChatGPT how to give me some simple example code, and I'll go from there, right? I don't want to go spend the 6 hours to figure out how the library works because it's one piece of a much bigger project. Delegation. Just need it done. I don't care how it gets done, so forth. Do I need it to nudge me, right? I'm having trouble figuring out how to do something, and I want to get into the groove of thinking about trying to do it. I want it to be my work. I'm going to go through the process of doing the hard work. I'm going to feel like I own it at the end, but there's lots of ways I get nudged, right? From asking my wife, like, I'm having trouble with this. She gives me something. I don't typically cite her in my papers, right? She probably would be horrified if I did. To just using it as a tool on steroids that we all use today, right? Spell checkers and grammar checkers and so forth. I've written this whole thing. Machines are much better at looking at details than we are as humans. I've misread this sentence 4 times, but there's a typo in it, right? Give it to a tool that can find me these typos. 3 very different uses of the tool, very different ways that I think we would view them as misconduct or not. And so getting past this very binary view of the world, I think is important.
I mean, this is partly what I mean by genre, because it may be less relevant in the sciences and social sciences, but the thing is that, after photography, the idea of making a realist painting, this is very crude and reductive for those of you who know better, but the kind of economy of realism changed, right?
Exactly.
And so now the economy of making, any kind of statement is changed. And I think that where a contribution, to use the problematic word, where authorship or originality lies is like an issue we'll have to figure out, in part by understanding what the tool actually does. And frankly, those of you who've read some ChatGPT, you can, maybe it's improving, I'm sure it is, but you can recognize, there are ways to know that this doesn't sound quite like a human, or at least the humans that, whose name is on the paper or whatever, or the article, so.
Yeah, I do think there's a tension, again, for those people who know how these tools really work. If you embed enough information, it starts to actually repeat the information, right? It's now a table lookup as opposed to a generation of a pattern and understanding and then doing new outcomes based on that pattern, as opposed to I've just memorized something versus I get the bigger pattern and it's more the paraphrasing side of the world.
One of my favorite uses for ChatGPT is in email when I'm really rushing and I send these harsh, I've got to run blah, just answering your email back, and people respond and clearly they're insulted because it was kind of written harshly. So I'll take this extra moment, I'll push the button, ChatGPT will write a very nice version of it, and then I send it. So after reading these for a while, I had to send a quick email to Chris Stubbs, and I sent it, but now I've learned how to write better, nicer, quick messages. I write the nicer, quick message. I actually write it. Chris Stubbs said, "Did you use ChatGPT?" I was like, what just happened in that learning experience?
Yeah.
But with that, let's open it up to the audience. If there are any questions, we've had quite a rich discussion. I don't know if we have mics, but you can stand up. You can stand up and we'll repeat the question. Oh, wait, we do have mics. They're running over to you. I didn't see you. It's good to see you.
Hi. Hi, hello. Oh, okay. Hi, my name is Nana. I am a student of Professor Dr. Sweeney. Really excited. And I'm also an ER doctor. One of the things that we've seen in the emergency department is how to customize use of ChatGPT and versions of AI to make it easier for workflow. But one of the hindrances I've seen is the gap in trust between patients who feel like you're trying to shortcut things and don't want to spend more time. And I'm also seeing that in my, academic work, in that maybe I've spent the time to write a whole paper, but I'm 300 words over. And so I throw it into ChatGPT and try to truncate it. And so my question to you is like, where we're trying to cut, time to be efficient, where is the loss in like the technique of being brief but succinct and still powerful, deferring that to AI? And the same thing, and as I'm seeing, I have to acknowledge that where I'm trying to cut corners in the ER, it's impacting the trust that my patients have with me. So I just want to ask about that.
So I'll say a few words. Back to the framework I was talking about. Understanding first and foremost, what are the important pieces of your process, right? Where can I make shortcuts? Where can I make things more efficient? As a patient that goes into medical facilities, like I don't want to feel like I'm just a cog being pushed through the machine, right? So how do you use these tools to make hospitals and individuals like yourself more efficient without losing the human touch? Part of it, I think, is extremely important. I think can be done, but it's going to require more than just we're going to throw the tool at everything we do.
Hi, Kyle Courtney. I'm at Harvard Library. I'm also a lawyer. So I'm very interested in...
Doctor and then lawyer.
and interested in this authorship idea. So we talked about plagiarism a little bit, which is like copyright law's cousin, right? It's an enforceable moral standard, right? It's not actually law. We don't have a law of plagiarism. We have things here, academic processes to encourage that. But authorship, when you say that under the law, is very particular, right? Saying it has to be human expression. And currently in the US, anything that emerges from any AI system is uncopyrightable, meaning even what comes out the other end, you can't claim as authored. But the middle line, and I think this is what this panel is getting at a little bit, is AI enhanced work, right? And so where you used AI to enhance something, but you're not necessarily surrendering your authorship under the legal phrase. And I just was interested in the panel's reflections on kind of what AI enhanced means for authorship versus something that purely comes out of ChatGPT, which is uncopyrightable, not owned by any human entity, and therefore unprotectable.
So I don't mean to take it, but first of all, I think we've started separating this appropriately. It still needs to, if we're going to copyright it, it still needs to be demonstrated that it was human adding something to it. I think it's going to be increasingly hard to be able to say, some of the definitions I've seen, it says anything that you can show in here that was machine generated cannot be copyrighted, and it's going to be somehow split out from the rest of the work. I think that's going to become increasingly problematic as these facilities and capabilities are introduced into more and more of the tools that we use every day. And we won't even know, right, when it's actually an enhancement through an AI that doesn't fit this definition and when it is. So I don't have the right answer for you. I'm glad to say that we're not copywriting AI material because it doesn't make any sense to me. But that's my own personal view.
I think one issue that I'm going to take your question sideways, which is that a lot of copyrighted material is being scraped for AI. And so I think in some ways we have to, I mean, I guess this is my theme for the day. We have to think of the back end as lay people. I mean, as not leaving it all to the engineers who are making the tools, to think about, is that okay? Like for the New York Times, I think there are suits around this right now that, is that okay that all that material is being scooped up and then it's a sort of machine for creating a commons, but what kind of commons is it really, given that it's being, deployed by companies? So, I mean, I think those are really strong ethical issues too that have to do with authorship, like where authorship matters and where it's counted, where it's sort of, well, that's just online, so it can't really be authored,
So,
like the copyrighted content being used to train the model. I mean, it's a very complicated issue because did OpenAI actually use the New York Times? Probably not. Like, we have a paper on this looking at real news, which is this just online news that you can find on the internet. A lot of other people stole the New York Times, poorly paraphrased it, and then that's duplicated in their training corpus. And so then they're reproducing it. But like, the problem is, I think like the end result of this is like, but because at the end of the day, it's not that much money to train one of these models. There was a leaked Google memo that said, we're not scared about competition from OpenAI, we're scared about the open source people, because at the end of the day, it's not like all that difficult. It doesn't take all that much money to train one of these models. Kind of, it's not trivial, but it's doable. But if you have to license like vast amounts of content, because even if you're not using that content, you're worried somebody else has ripped that off and it's in your snapshot of the internet, that really complicates being able to have open source models. I'm very interested in how these models perform on, in low resource settings. And I also worry that makes it so it's only commercially lucrative for OpenAI to license this content. And so we're not gonna bother to license this lower resource non-English content, and then the model's just not gonna have that in that. So I think it's like an incredibly complicated set of issues where, like, on the one hand, like, it's very problematic that the model's like regenerating copyrighted content, but on the other hand, I think that the publishing industry is incredibly powerful, and I think that this could make the entire kind of sector very much only capable of being sort of controlled by these huge firms with huge valuations, and it has impacts for like how representative the model is of human knowledge. If like you're mostly putting stuff you license into it because you don't want to get sued.
Yeah, we're definitely in the tragedy of the commons right now, where what's taking place with the AI companies, I don't think is right by any stretch of the imagination. But just to point and say it's scraping and using is not getting us somewhere. Because look, I go on the internet, I learn some things, and I use it.
It does.
I'm not the same thing as an AI company, though. So
it does seem to me that copyright is a pretty weak. Again, my theme is always these are weak notions to begin with. Copyright has always been problematic in all sorts of ways, and it was always a compromise that was worked out to deal with a sort of real difficult set of problems to do with how we encourage originality and at the same time sort of keep things open. But it really, my sense is that copyright angle on this is not. It's not, for some of the reasons that Melissa is suggesting, it's not going to be a way to, my sense is these suits are going to be lost, at least in the US context. I think that the defense is going to be pretty strong. And we're going to have to look elsewhere if we want to find ways to sort of put limits on how this is, how LLMs are operating. It's not going to be happening through copyright. It could be through cultural norms, at least in academia, right? It's much more about the culture of our decisions about what's good conduct and what's bad conduct, and being intentional about this than any kind of legal framework that's not what's going to sort of save us, I think. And so I kind of think that copyright thing is a red herring ultimately. Also because, if another sort of key concept that's floating around here is sort of just the open access question, which you might, one potential result of this is, in a sense, a lot more stuff becomes open because of the kind of copyright laundering that's sort of happening, which I don't mean that as a necessarily morally bad thing. It's what's happening in some sense. That in itself is not necessarily, having things more and more open is not necessarily the number one end goal of things either, it seems to me. Open access is not a sort of unmitigated good. So all of this is really tricky, but copyright, I think, is not the way to approach the question.
Anyway, there's your answer.
But, in some ways, you guys are making a more difficult future. So suppose we're having this panel. Suppose we make a date. We come back in 3 to 5 years. And what has happened? Well, they're still scraping the public internet to build the large language models. And in that process, but the world that they're scraping online isn't like it is now. It's not where most of the content online is produced by humans right now. And that's what's in LLMs. But we're becoming into an echo chamber where most of the content online is produced by an LLM. And it's nothing more than a repeat, which means that the edges, the unusual content is just bleeded out, and all we get is pretty much generic content. It really does speak to a kind of genre, but it also, and then at the same time, there's an economics behind these copyright questions that isn't being resolved and so far, but it's really linked to this notion of original scholarship. Anyone can write a research paper, stick it in a public repository. Those are getting much more cited than the things that go through the peer review process and is behind a paywall. And that has consequences, too, to what we think is what knowledge is and so forth. But if that's what's easily available and that's what's easily replicated and infused in these LLMs, it also changes our notion of what is truth and what is science and what is known. So I'd love to hear you guys talk about what we would be saying in that world 5 years from now.
And I think, we've had various conversations about where can Harvard, where can academia lead? And I think it's important to remember that this is a commercial technology. And at the end of the day, it's designed with those commercial objectives, which are different from ours. So I got into a big debate with somebody I know who works in AI. And he was claiming that large language models are trained on world knowledge. And I said, no, they're not, because think of everything in Widener that's not in them. And that's like what a lot of my work focuses on, is trying to get that into kind of a digital format. It's like, who cares about that? Like, in a single day, a single person, I generate more emails than Shakespeare ever wrote. And you're putting a value judgment on knowledge by saying that Shakespeare is more valuable than my emails. And for the technology that we are trying to develop, we're trying to make a chatbot that answers your emails for you, or that does this or that. And what you care about is the content that's generated in this moment. And because we live in this digital world, we're generating more content every day than is in all of Widener. But like, I have a value judgment, right? That like Shakespeare is like more valuable than my emails, right? But like, that's not necessarily how people kind of in this space working on these models think about it, because at the end of the day, there is a commercial objective. And so I think that that's why it's like enormously important for us to bring this kind of academic perspective to it. Copyright goes back to the 1920s, so it is complicated. Like in some sense, we'd like, that information to be in there, but like half the time it's like, there's an orphan works problem. Like there is nobody to get the copyright permission from, right? And so I think that these are really difficult issues, but I think like we do not want to be in that world where, the language model is just really good, like at the emails, but that's probably like, where, where a lot of this is headed, right? Because that is the commercial application. So I think as a university, like we have a role to play when we're thinking about the future of the libraries. I mean, I think that this is enormously important. So, historians, of course, spend a lot of time thinking about how people who leave behind documents aren't representative of humanity, which is absolutely true. But when you move to kind of digital stuff that these models can digest, the skew becomes much, much worse. OCR technology is designed to digitize receipts in English. It, starts to break horribly. And that's because of how the technology was designed. But I think that there's a huge role for the libraries to think about how do we get that information that's in Widener and in the offsite storage and work out the legal things so that we can have this all accessible, through a large language model. It will enhance scholarship because now I don't have to go spend weeks ordering stuff from offsite storage to find what I'm looking for. It's also I think it's like an insurance mechanism because you can, and there's more and more work happening on this, getting a large language model to run on a laptop. You ingest all of this. Let's say that something absolutely horrible happens and that all burns to the ground. Like that is preserved for future generations, almost just from a kind of a security perspective as well. And so I think we definitely do not want to be in that future where just the model ingests all this generic content. It doesn't ingest the more diverse content. This goes back to your point about training data. And I thought your point here about the prompts was really interesting. If we think about the fiasco from Google a couple of months ago, where they have this image generation model, it's basically trained on white people because that's what's in the snapshot of the internet. And then they kind of change their system prompt. And they just add kind of things in there to get it to generate, more diverse content without kind of actually making the training data more diverse, because the latter is vastly more work, right, than changing your system prompt. And I think that there is a huge role for us as academics to play in that and to push back against this knowledge, this concept that world knowledge is knowledge that can be commercialized versus knowledge that we think has value, even if the commercial value of it is lower.
Yeah, it gets back to what you and Chris were talking about earlier too. There's a boundary, right? There's work that this LLM does well and there's work that doesn't. Cultural issues are one of those, right? It knows a lot about certain cultures and very little about lots of other cultures in this world. And the best thing we can do is teach our students that they should be skeptical, as Chris was saying earlier, and that they've got to question everything that comes out of this, because there's a lot to question.
Well, there also are affirmative biases, not just knowing less. So that's important, to mark too.
Yeah, completely agree.
I mean, I think it's, Latanya, in terms of your question about 3 or 4 years from now, what do I know? But if you look at the history of the internet and how people, those of us who are old enough to remember in the mid-90s when it, became a thing, and it was a kind of utopian space for many people, a space where identity could migrate, where you didn't have to be who you were, et cetera, et cetera. And now, it's a giant shopping mall, but also many other things. But I think that, I think it's important to remember that there is this cycle of kind of enthusiasm and utopian hope and terror of technologies that then settles a little bit, and often they're commercialized. I mean, television was also a version of this, and
So was radio.
radio. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Oh, we got a couple of hands up now. You got to run the mic. I'd love to work our way over towards here, but maybe we could do it. There's one right beside you. Oh, if we have two mics, maybe one over there.
Yeah, you can come there.
Yeah.
Hello. Thank you so much for the wonderful, interesting conversation. So I teach neurobiology and neurodiversity at Harvard Extension School. And I am mostly interested in how AI helps neurodivergent individuals. Like, for example, myself, I live with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And I love what you mentioned about the delegation and time efficiency. So that is extremely important. And I had a conversation with one of my students, and she was very mindful about it. And she's kind of like, before it would take us about 10 hours, exactly what you were saying, to get information. And she would put it on a block situation, right? So that was the first block. And then now you can have that instead of 10 hours in just an instant, in just a second. So then you can start building from those, from that time, kind of like, you can start building with these blocks a more creative solution in a more time. And also what I would love to know, just the other. So motivation as well. So there is this component called initiation task paralysis. So AI has helped neurodivergent individuals to get inspiration on how to get started. And AI or grammar checking, for example. I need to grammar check. English is not my first language, so I need to grammar check everything on my classes. And this helps, for example, individuals with dyslexia, for example. So my question is, how have you used AI in your courses and beyond? Thank you.
We do have a panel coming up on teaching learning, but these things do dovetail into original scholarship. If you are neurodivergent and you're using it in a different way for different reasons, then we may have thought about how does that impact?
I mean, go ahead. Well, I think we have some of this today, right? I already make accommodations in my class for different students to use different tools that helps them to what I care most about, which is be able to access the material, do the work, struggle with the material, do the learning that they need to do in it. Very briefly, because I know we have other panels coming up, right? We use generative AI in I do an intro CS class, right? And somewhat to level the field too. It doesn't even have to be neurodivergent. It's just different people come in with different backgrounds. They have different places that they have holes. Lots of different resources for them. Generative AI is one. We cap the kinds of things you can do with it so that we're making sure that shortcuts aren't being made that are detrimental to the learning that they're taking place in the class. And I think that's the kind of frame you need to have. What is actually helpful to whoever the student happens to be able to access the material and do the work so that it's at the right level of difficulty for them to learn.
I just think there might be a razor effect there. You have to be careful because in the rethinking of what's allowed use, you may, and then this is a group that may have an exception to that, then all of a sudden, all of it's useful, the very thing you were trying to protect against. So it is kind of a tricky bit to it. There was another question?
Hi, good morning. My name is Stephen Elias. I'm a graduate student in international relations here. Thank you for speaking to us today and helping us learn about this topic. My question is about original scholarship. So taking a utilitarian view on papers I may have to write this summer semester and this fall semester, is it up to the professor teaching us to establish what the AI policy is? Because through many emails from the school about using ChatGPT, I've never used it for fear of using it improperly. So does that now have to go in our abstract of how AI was used in this particular paper, as far as perhaps I don't understand an economic forecasting regression model and I ask AI to help me understand what is the strongest one that everybody knows. And now I understand it much better and I can write about it with some knowledge, but how do I state that, or how do I cite the AI delegation of that process? Thank Thank you.
Great question. Are you asking me or? I'll tell you the first answer is I write something on my syllabus that says how it is the students should interact. I also write, you should come talk to me, right? Because I'm sure what I write does not explain it well enough to students. I think it's incumbent on all of us to be very open and have ongoing communications between the students and the members of the teaching staff while we get through this time, so that because there's no easy blurb, there's no social norm. It's hard. Communication's the only way.
Yeah, and I do think it has to be a policy that varies at a minimum by discipline, if not by course. If you're taking a writing course, it might just be totally unacceptable. In the context of another course, it may be no big deal, right? And so that's why it might seem kind of piecemeal, but I think in some sense it has to be, because what is the important thing you learn from that course is going to vary from course to course, and it's going to interact in different ways with Gen AI.
And probably your instructor is as confused as you are.
Sometimes more.
We have 2 minutes left. That'll give 30 seconds to each of you if you had a final thought or sentence. And don't try to get an answer from ChatGPT.
I'll start because I just think having discussions like this across the divisions is really helpful. And for me, it was, I learned a lot from it. So I think it would be great to have more of them.
I'll say, for those of you who are faculty or teach, try figuring out how to use it in your classroom. Right? The only way we're going to get moved forward here, and I don't just mean just go play with it, but try to think about how to use it in an effective way that will change your research or your teaching. Start small. I think it's the best way.
Yeah, and I think on that note, I mean, moving forward, this is going to be part of the landscape. It's going to be everything. It's going to be in your code editor. It's going to be in Microsoft Word. Thinking about how you can guide students or yourself, use it to augment your ability to do original work where you still have that original component, because in some sense it's incredibly good at compressing a lot of information and allowing you to retrieve it, but there's still that role for the human to have that original creative idea, and how can you use it to augment that?
Yeah, and I guess on an optimistic note, I think this was Chris who mentioned that the barriers for, like, say, most historians don't use these sorts of technical tools in their work, but the barriers to doing some programming in one's historical work seem like they're going to be super lowered by this, which is, if everything goes really well, going to lead to more interesting original work, which should be really kind of fun. So that's good.
Well, let's leave on a positive note. Thank you very much.